What happens when 37 years of untouchable political power collides head-on with 20 years of military discipline and undeniable integrity? You are about to witness the exact moment a career politician made the ultimate mistake of underestimating a combat veteran on live television. A blunder that effectively ended a 4-decade dynasty in just 90 minutes. It was a confrontation that the establishment never saw coming, and it started with a single, venomous insult that backfired so spectacularly it sent shockwaves through the entire American political landscape. The atmosphere inside the News Nation studios for America's Town Hall was electric, thick with a tension that felt like the air before a lightning strike. This wasn't just another televised debate. It was being billed as a generational conversation about the future of the Democratic Party. On one side stood Nancy Pelosi, the 84-year-old former Speaker of the House, a woman who had navigated the corridors of power longer than many of the viewers had been alive. She walked onto the stage with the calculated grace of a queen returning to her kingdom, draped in a burgundy Giorgio Armani designer suit worth $4,800 and adorned with a pearl necklace valued at approximately $15,000. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, and she wore a practiced, elitist smile that signaled she was ready to deliver a lecture to a disobedient student. To her, this was supposed to be easy, just another younger politician to put in her place. On the other side sat Tulsi Gabbard, the 43-year-old combat veteran and former congresswoman. Tulsi didn't bring an entourage of crisis management specialists or media consultants. She sat in her chair with the calm, focused bearing of someone who had faced enemy fire in actual war zones and found political posturing far less intimidating. While Pelosi relied on her gravitas and highlighted note cards, Tulsi arrived with a different kind of ammunition. An iPad loaded with documented facts, stock trading records, and photographs of a city in crisis. The moderator, Chris Cuomo, had barely finished introducing the format before Nancy Pelosi decided to go nuclear. She didn't wait for a question. She went straight for the jugular with a tone usually reserved for scolding a naughty child. She spoke gravely about people who parrot Kremlin talking points and question the intelligence community, finally turning her gaze directly toward Tulsi. In front of a live audience of millions, Pelosi leveled the ultimate insult. She called Tulsi Gabbard a useful idiot for Putin. The studio went dead silent. You could almost hear the collective gasp of the audience. It was a staggering accusation to hurl at a decorated combat veteran and a sitting lieutenant colonel in the Army National Guard. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as the camera caught the contrast between the two women. Pelosi, with her tight, superior smirk, and Tulsi, who didn't flinch or blink. Instead, Tulsi smiled, not a political smile, but the cold, steady smile of a soldier who had just spotted the enemy's position. "That's a serious accusation," Chris Cuomo stammered, clearly panicked as the segment went off the rails in the first 60 seconds. But Tulsi was already moving. She didn't just defend her patriotism, she flipped the script entirely. She spoke with a voice as hard as steel, reminding Pelosi and the world that she had held a security clearance for 2 decades and had deployed to combat zones where people were actively trying to kill her. She framed the insult not just as a personal attack, but as a slap in the face to every service member who had ever put their life on the line. "So, let's talk about who's been useful to foreign interests, shall we?" Tulsi said calmly. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. The career politician had brought a knife to a gunfight, while the veteran had brought a digital mountain of evidence. Tulsi reached for her iPad and tapped the screen, signaling to the production team to put her first slide on the massive studio monitors. She didn't just offer an opinion. She presented a timeline. She started with Pelosi's policy positions on China, contrasting them with the Pelosi family's business dealings and her husband's remarkably timed investments. The audience was now leaning forward, riveted by the sight of a political icon being dismantled by her own record. Pelosi's face began to flush. her practiced composure showing the first visible cracks as Tulsi highlighted the disconnect between $100 a pint ice cream lifestyle and the reality of the families Pelosi claimed to represent. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was an interrogation. Pelosi had tried to frame Tulsi as a traitor, but Tulsi was busy framing Pelosi as a profiteer of the system. The camera pans to the massive studio screen as Tulsi taps her iPad, bringing up the first set of ammunition that would turn this political theater into a full-scale forensic audit of a 37-year legacy. The spreadsheet of secrets. Tulsi Gabbard settled back into her chair, her eyes fixed on the former speaker, with a piercing intensity that seemed to bypass the television cameras and strike at the very heart of the establishment. The air in the studio, already heavy from the initial exchange, grew even colder as she reached for her iPad. Pelosi's superior smirk remained, but there was a flicker of something new in her eyes, a calculated wariness. She had spent decades burying her critics under the weight of her seniority, but she had never faced an opponent who came armed with a digital forensic audit. "Let's talk about the money, Nancy," Tulsi said, her voice steady and devoid of theatricality. Because nothing scares a career politician like a spreadsheet they thought was buried under the rug of congressional immunity. As Tulsi swiped her screen, the massive studio monitors behind them flickered to life, displaying a series of financial charts that looked more like the portfolio of a high-frequency hedge fund manager than a public servant. The crowd leaned forward, the sudden shift from political banter to hard data catching everyone off guard. Tulsi began to dissect the financial life of the Pelosi family with the precision of a surgeon. She pointed to a marker on the screen, dated the 18th of December, 2020. At that moment, while the rest of the country was reeling from pandemic-induced economic paralysis, Paul Pelosi was busy purchasing $1 million in Tesla call options. It was a massive bet that the stock would skyrocket. And, as if by magic, just 3 weeks later, on the 7th of January, 2021, the Biden administration announced a sweeping electric vehicle infrastructure plan. Tesla's stock didn't just rise, it soared. The profit from that single, perfectly timed move exceeded $500,000. Think about that for a second. While small businesses were being boarded up and families were wondering how to pay rent, the speaker's household was making $500,000 on a single trade. Does that sound like a free market to you, or does it sound like an inside track? Pelosi's reaction was immediate and visceral. The practiced, grandmotherly smile tightened into a thin, hard line. Her eyes narrowed, tracking the numbers on the screen with a mixture of anger and alarm. "My husband makes his own investment decisions," she interjected, her voice tight. "I have no involvement in his business affairs. We are a free market economy." Tulsi didn't skip a beat. "Is it a free market, Nancy? Or is it a rigged game where you get to see everyone's cards while they're blindfolded?" Tulsi tapped the screen again, bringing up a purchase from the 18th of June, 2021. Paul Pelosi had poured $4 million into big tech stocks: Apple, Microsoft, Google. Less than 2 weeks later, the House Judiciary Committee, an entity over which Nancy Pelosi held immense influence, held high-stakes hearings on antitrust legislation. That legislation, which threatened to dismantle those very companies, was mysteriously shelved. Tech stocks rallied in relief, and the Pelosi household walked away with $1.8 million in profit. The audience was riveted. The sheer scale of the coincidences was beginning to feel astronomical. If you're watching this and thinking, "I wish I had that kind of luck," you're missing the point. This isn't luck. It's leverage. Tulsi moved to what she called her favorite example. The 12th of July, 2022. The screen displayed a massive position in semiconductor giants like NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel. These weren't small trades, they were multi-million-dollar positions. Exactly 3 weeks later, Nancy Pelosi stood on the House floor and pushed through the CHIPS Act, a $52 billion subsidy for the very manufacturers her husband had just bet on. Nvidia hit record highs almost instantly. The profit on that trade? A staggering $3.2 million. Tulsi looked up from her iPad, her gaze locking onto Pelosi's. Every single trade is perfectly timed around legislation you voted on, bills you influenced, and policies you controlled. Your husband doesn't have the luck of a lottery winner. He has the wife of a speaker. Let's look at the Nvidia miracle specifically. On July 12th, Paul Pelosi buys up to $5 million in Nvidia call options. At that moment, the CHIPS Act was considered stalled in Congress. The average investor was staying away. But then, on July 19th, the Senate suddenly holds a surprise procedural vote to move the bill forward. By the time the bill passes the House on July 28th and Nancy Pelosi votes yes, the stock has already jumped. The Pelosis didn't just win. They won before the public even knew the race was back on. Comment insider below if you think this timing is more than just a coincidence. We need to wake up and realize that while we're following the rules, they're writing them to suit their bank accounts. The analysis deepened as Tulsi pulled up a comparison that would leave the room in stunned silence. Over the period between 2019 and 2023, Paul Pelosi made over 40 trades that aligned almost perfectly with his wife's legislative calendar. 40 trades. The odds of that happening by chance are 1 in several billion. Tulsi highlighted a chart showing Nancy Pelosi's net worth progression. When she first became Speaker, her net worth was estimated at $40 million. Today, it stands at over $250 million. That is a 525% increase. To put that in perspective, the S&P 500, the benchmark for the world's best investors, grew by 400% in the same period. Pelosi hadn't just beaten the market. She had crushed it by 125 percentage points. Professional hedge fund managers who spend 20 hours a day analyzing data can't beat the market consistently, Tulsi remarked. The best investors in history, the Warren Buffetts of the world, struggle to maintain that kind of lead. But somehow, a couple in Washington managed to do it perfectly, trade after trade. The word corruption began to echo through the room, not as an insult, but as a logical conclusion derived from the data on the screen. Tulsi brought up the case of Martha Stewart, reminding the audience that the lifestyle icon went to federal prison for a single trade involving $45,000. Think about that $45,000. Paul Pelosi makes that much during a lunch break on some days. Martha Stewart lost her freedom for a fraction of what your husband makes in a single afternoon, Tulsi said, her voice dropping to a somber, authoritative tone. The only difference between a prison cell and a mansion in Pacific Heights is congressional immunity and a better class of lawyers. Pelosi tried to pivot back to her talking points, mentioning her decades of service and the rules that allow spousal investments. But Tulsi cut through the noise. The rules? You wrote the rules, Nancy. When the public demanded a ban on congressional stock trading, a move supported by 76% of Americans, you were the one who stood up and said, "We are a free market economy." But you're not playing in the market. You're playing poker where you get to see everyone's cards and they can't see yours. That's not capitalism. That's an oligarchy. If you're tired of seeing politicians get rich while the rest of the country struggles with inflation, you need to share this video right now. We cannot let this stay hidden. Hit that share button because the mainstream media won't show you these spreadsheets. To understand how deep this goes, consider the Visa scandal from years prior. While the House was considering credit card reform legislation that would hurt Visa's bottom line, the Pelosis were granted access to a massive IPO of Visa stock shares that weren't available to the general public. They bought in, the legislation was delayed, and they made millions. It's a recurring theme. Use the power of the gavel to influence the value of the ticker symbol. Tulsi pointed out that this is exactly why trust in government is at an all-time low. People see $13 a pint ice cream in a $25,000 refrigerator. and they see $250 million in net worth on a congressional salary, and they know the math doesn't add up. If you want to protect your own finances from this kind of systemic manipulation, you have to start by tracking what they do, not what they say. There are now apps and websites dedicated solely to tracking Pelosi trades in real time. Why? Because the public has realized that the best way to predict the market is to watch the people who regulate it. It's a sad state of affairs when the most reliable financial indicator in America is the legislative calendar of the Speaker of the House. You can start today by demanding accountability. Call your representatives and tell them you support the Trust in Congress Act to ban this practice once and for all. Don't let them tell you it's too complicated. It's simple. You either serve the people or you serve your portfolio. You can't do both. The numbers didn't lie, and every person in the studio could see the pattern. It wasn't about the Republican or Democratic Party. It was about a system where those who write the rules are the same ones who profit from them. Tulsi had successfully framed the debate as a choice between the free market Pelosi claimed to defend and the protection racket she was actually running. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, with Pelosi's section sitting in stunned, defensive silence while the rest of the audience began to murmur in visible outrage. Pelosi's hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. She had survived 4 decades of political warfare, but she had never been confronted with her own bank statements on a 60-foot screen. The charts showed a legacy of extraction, where public service was used as a cover for private enrichment. It was a masterclass in how to dismantle an icon using nothing but the truth. Tulsi sat back, letting the final profit tallies linger on the screen for the cameras to capture. She had accomplished her mission in this segment. She had stripped away the grandmother of the party persona and revealed the hedge fund manager of the House. As the audience gasped at the sheer audacity of the Nvidia and Tesla trades, Tulsi swiped her iPad one last time. The screen went dark for a second before a new set of images appeared. She was moving the focus now from the secret bank accounts and marble corridors of Washington to the grim, heartbreaking reality of the streets Pelosi claimed to represent. The transition was seamless and devastating, signaling that the forensic audit was moving from the boardrooms to the sidewalks of San Francisco, and the worst was yet to come for Nancy Pelosi. Stay tuned, because what Tulsi reveals next about Pelosi's home district will leave you absolutely speechless. You won't believe the contrast between the Pelosi mansion and the reality of the people living just a few miles away. Poop maps and Pacific Heights. Nancy Pelosi tried to pivot to January 6th to regain the moral high ground, but Tulsi Gabbard was already 3 steps ahead. She didn't just allow the subject change. She used it as a bridge to show the staggering disconnect between the corridors of power and the reality on the ground. "You want to talk about threats to democracy?" Tulsi asked, her voice shifting into a sharp military command tone that instantly silenced the room. "Let's look at the actual result of your version of democracy in the very streets you have represented for 37 years. The lights in the studio dimmed as the screen flickered to life, showing a side of San Francisco that the tourism brochures and political campaign ads never mention. The first image was an absolute gut punch. A massive tent encampment stretching down an entire city block in downtown San Francisco. It wasn't just a few isolated tents. It was a sprawling, desperate village constructed of blue tarps, scrap wood, and despair, standing right in the shadow of gleaming luxury high-rises and tech headquarters. Tulsi swiped to the next photo, and a collective gasp rippled through the audience. It showed open-air drug use in broad daylight. Individuals hunched over with needles and glass pipes, drug paraphernalia scattered across a sidewalk like autumn leaves, while commuters in expensive business suits walked past as if the suffering people were merely ghosts. The third image was even more visceral, showing what was clearly human waste smeared across a public street. Even though the image was blurred for television standards, the context was unmistakable and revolting. The audience's reaction was immediate and physical. Some people looked genuinely ill, turning their heads away in disgust, while others leaned forward, horrified by the visible decay of a legendary American city. "This is your legacy, Nancy," Tulsi said, her voice dropping to a quiet, deadly, serious level. "While you were busy building a $250 million personal empire, the median home price in your district hit $1.4 million. You have successfully priced out the very teachers, nurses, and police officers who keep this city running. You've turned San Francisco into a playground for the ultra-rich and a graveyard for the poor." Tulsi then presented what she called a forensic audit of failure. She pointed to the statistics appearing on the monitors. The homeless population had surged by 47% during Pelosi's recent tenure, and fentanyl-related deaths had skyrocketed by a terrifying 400% since 2018. It was a portrait of a city in a terminal death spiral. She moved on to the retail flight, listing the empty husks of stores that used to be community staples. Walgreens had closed 17 locations. Target and Whole Foods had either reduced hours to near uselessness or shut down completely because of rampant, organized retail theft and safety concerns for their staff. If the city is as vibrant and safe as your press releases claim, why are the businesses fleeing in droves? Tulsi challenged. And why does San Francisco have something no other civilized city needs? Poop maps. She pulled up a smartphone app on her iPad and mirrored it to the big screen. The audience saw a map of downtown San Francisco littered with hundreds of brown digital markers, each one indicating a reported instance of human waste on the sidewalk. Actual residents had to build an app just to navigate their way to work without stepping in filth. That is the crown jewel of your 37-year career. Some in the audience laughed nervously, while others looked like they wanted to cry. The contrast Tulsi drew next was the ultimate climax of the segment. "Where exactly do you live in San Francisco, Madam Speaker?" Pelosi's jaw tightened, her carefully practiced composure finally shattering into visible anger. "I don't see how my private residence is relevant to a discussion on national policy," she stammered, her voice shaking slightly. Tulsi didn't wait for her to finish. "It's relevant because of the contrast. You live in Pacific Heights. You live in a $25 million mansion hidden behind security gates and protected by private 24-hour guards. Your neighborhood doesn't have poop maps. Your street doesn't have tent cities. Your sidewalk isn't a needles and feces obstacle course. You've completely insulated yourself from the consequences of the very policies you impose on everyone else. While the working class in your district has to step over needles to get their kids to school, you're watching the sunset from a fortress. This is the textbook definition of extraction, the political class, extracting wealth and power from the system while leaving nothing but poverty, chaos, and addiction behind for the people they supposedly represent." Tulsi looked directly into the camera, breaking the fourth wall. How can anyone in Washington claim to lead a nation when they can't even secure the sidewalks of their own home district? If you're tired of seeing these limousine liberals preach to you from behind their gated estates while your communities fall apart, hit that like button right now. We need to send a message that this is no longer acceptable. The silence from the Pelosi supporters in the room was deafening. They had come to cheer for a political icon, but they were instead watching a veteran dismantle a career based on 37 years of empty promises. Tulsi stood up, a rare move that commanded every single eye in the building. The physical height difference emphasized her point. She looked like a commander overlooking a battlefield. You've had nearly 4 decades. You've had billions in federal funding channeled through your office. You've had total control of the political machinery of San Francisco. What is your excuse? Is it incompetence? Or is it that you just don't care because it doesn't happen on your street? Pelosi sat frozen, her face drained of color. She realized in that moment that the photos had spoken a truth that her polished talking points and partisan deflections could never erase. It was the moment the Queen of the House was shown to have no clothes. The Poop Map app remained on the screen behind her, a digital brand of shame that summarized her legacy better than any speech ever could. If you think it's time for representatives to actually live under the laws and conditions they create for the rest of us, comment reality. Check below. We need to see who is actually paying attention to this crisis. But Tulsi wasn't finished. She wasn't just there to talk about the streets. She was there to talk about the system. She leaned forward, her gaze intensifying as she prepared to deliver the final blow of the segment. She was moving the conversation from the crime on the streets to the security failures and lack of transparency at the very heart of the government, the things Pelosi had spent years trying to hide. The transition was sharp and purposeful, moving from the visible decay of a city to the hidden decay of a political cover-up. Pelosi thought she was safe, moving the topic to January 6th, but she was about to find out that Tulsi had the receipts for that day, too. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a full-scale dismantling of a political dynasty, and the audience was seeing the truth in high definition for the first time. Stay right here, because what comes next, regarding the deleted records and denied security, will make everything you've seen so far look like a warm-up. If you want to see the documents they tried to lose in a phone upgrade, you cannot afford to miss this next part. The security failure and deleted records. Nancy Pelosi's attempts to hide behind the perceived safety of a national tragedy were about to be systematically dismantled by the one person she never expected to have the receipts. Tulsi Gabbard leaned forward, her gaze intensifying as she prepared to turn Pelosi's own favorite political weapon back against her. You want to talk about threats to democracy, Nancy? Let's talk about your specific role on January 6th, Tulsi interrupted, her voice cutting through Pelosi's practiced talking points like a razor. The former speaker's expression shifted instantly from moral superiority to a flicker of genuine alarm. She had used that day as a political hammer for years, but the hammer was about to swing back. You controlled House security that day, correct? Tulsi pressed. Security decisions are made by the Sergeant-at-Arms, who reports directly to you, who you appoint and who you control. Yes or no? Pelosi hesitated, her hands smoothing her designer suit, looking for a way out. The speaker has oversight, but security is handled by the professionals, she stammered. Tulsi didn't give her an inch. Thank you, so you had control. Let's look at what those professionals were actually asking for. Tulsi tapped her iPad, and a series of internal documents flashed onto the massive studio screens. These weren't just news reports, they were official requests with timestamps. Tulsi pointed to a document dated January 4th, 2021, 2 full days before the certification of the Electoral College. The Capitol Police submitted a formal request for 10,000 National Guard troops to be pre-deployed. They cited intelligence about potential violence. They requested backup. That request went to House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving, your direct subordinate. The request was denied. Why? Pelosi had no good answer. She tried the hindsight deflection, but Tulsi was relentless. This wasn't hindsight, Nancy. This was foresight you ignored. The FBI had briefed you. The warnings were in your hand. The request for help was on your desk. You denied the National Guard, and then you spent 2 years creating a committee to investigate everyone except yourself. The room went deafeningly silent as the gravity of the accusation took hold. Think about that for a second. 10,000 troops could have stood between that building and the chaos, and the order to stop them came from the very top. If you think the American people deserve to know why that request was blocked, hit that share button right now. This is the information the mainstream media won't touch. And then there is the matter of transparency, Tulsi continued, her voice dropping to a somber, investigative tone. The committee you controlled subpoenaed phone records and emails from everyone, Republicans, staff members, security officials. But where are your communications from that day? Your phone records were lost in a phone upgrade. That was your official excuse. A major security failure occurs under your watch, and the evidence vanishes during a technical update? Tulsi shook her head slowly. That's not leadership. That's cowardice. That's a cover-up. Pelosi was visibly shaky now, her hands trembling as she reached for her water. She had spent 2 years acting as the Grand Inquisitor, but now she was the one in the hot seat. Let's break down the math of this technical glitch. The House Sergeant-at-Arms reports to the Speaker. On January 6th, the person in that role was Paul Irving. He resigned immediately after the event. Why? Because the failure was systemic. Tulsi highlighted a story we should all remember. When the Jan 6 committee asked for Pelosi's own internal communications regarding security posture, they were told the records simply didn't exist anymore. In the military, if we lose equipment or records during a mission failure, we don't get to say, "Oops, I upgraded my phone." Tulsi barked. We face a court-martial. You faced a promotion of your own narrative. Comment, cover up below if you're tired of the rules for thee, but not for me, attitude in Washington. We are talking about the safety of the U.S. Capitol. And the person in charge lost the receipts. Tulsi listed the uninvestigated questions one by one, her voice gaining strength. Why was the National Guard denied? What did the Speaker know about the specific threats from the FBI briefings on January 5th? Why were the communications deleted? You had one job on January 6th, keep the Capitol secure. You failed. Then you spent 2 years prosecuting others while exempting yourself from scrutiny. That is the ultimate threat to democracy, a leader who is above the law. The realization hit the audience like a physical weight. The oversight wasn't just a failure, it was a choice. The records didn't just disappear, they were scrubbed. Pelosi sat shaken, unable to defend a reporting structure she had carefully curated for decades. She had built a career on being untouchable. But in front of 150 million viewers, Tulsi Gabbard had just shown she was anything but. If you want to see a government that actually answers to the people, you have to support those who are willing to speak truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable. Like if you agree that no politician should be able to delete their records after a national crisis. Tulsi leaned in for the finishing blow of this segment. You turned a tragedy into a political weapon while hiding your own tracks. You asked for 10,000 troops for your own inauguration a few weeks later, but denied them when the Capitol Police actually begged for them on the 4th. That's not oversight, Nancy. That's using security as a partisan tool. Pelosi's face was drained of color, her hands now clutching her notes so tightly they began to crinkle. Chris Cuomo, looking shell-shocked by the intensity of the forensic teardown, realized the broadcast was spiraling into territory his producers hadn't prepared for. In a desperate attempt to move to safer ground, he tried to change the subject to connecting with working Americans. He thought he was throwing Pelosi a lifeline. Instead, he was leading her into the most infamous trap of all, a moment that would highlight her elitism more than any security failure ever could. Get ready, because we're about to go from the halls of Congress to a $25,000 refrigerator filled with $13 ice cream. You won't believe how Tulsi handles the Marie Antoinette of Washington. Stay tuned, because the climax of this debate is about to go nuclear. Ice cream and ripped speeches. The shift in Tulsi's tone signaled that the time for polite political banter had officially ended. She had just exposed the security lapses of January 6th, leaving Nancy Pelosi visibly shaken. But she was about to move from the halls of power to the kitchen of elitism. Tulsi smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Oh, Nancy connects with working Americans," Tulsi said with a biting sarcasm that made the studio audience erupt in nervous laughter. "She just does it from behind a $25,000 refrigerator." The screen flickered to life with a video clip from March 2020. It was the height of the pandemic. Lockdowns were being enforced. Businesses were shuttering, and economic collapse was looming over every household. The footage showed Nancy Pelosi on a late-night talk show, cheerfully giving viewers a tour of her high-end kitchen. The camera panned across commercial-grade appliances and marble countertops before settling on a massive Sub-Zero refrigerator. With a flourish, Pelosi opened the freezer to reveal multiple pints of Jenny's splendid ice cream. "I don't know what I would have done without ice cream," she said in the clip, laughing as she pointed to her stash of premium chocolate. Tulsi let the clip fade to black, but the silence it left in the room was heavy and angry. "Let me remind everyone what was actually happening that week," Tulsi said, her voice dropping to a somber, authoritative level. March 2020 was the week that 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment, the largest spike in our nation's history. Small businesses weren't just reducing hours, they were shutting down forever. I saw restaurant owners crying in empty dining rooms because their life savings had vanished in a week. And while they were losing everything, you were on national television showing off $13 a pint ice cream in a refrigerator that costs more than most Americans make in a year. The contrast was devastating. Tulsi was defining the modern Marie Antoinette moment, the let them eat cake philosophy, updated for a digital age. To put this in perspective, that $25,000 refrigerator alone represents nearly half of the median annual income for an American family. While mothers were standing in food bank lines for the first time in their lives, the speaker was curatorially explaining flavor profiles of gourmet sweets. If you think this kind of elite disconnect is exactly what's wrong with our leadership, comment "Ice Cream Elite" below. We need to see who else is fed up with this rules for the lifestyle. But Tulsi didn't stop at the freezer. She moved immediately to the infamous Salon Gate footage from August 2020. The security camera video played on the screen, showing Pelosi walking through a San Francisco hair salon, unmasked, getting her hair done indoors, while every other salon in California was barred from operating under lockdown orders she vocally supported. "You didn't apologize when you got caught," Tulsi remarked, her gaze locked on Pelosi. "You blamed the salon owner. You called it a setup. That woman was a small business owner in your own district facing bankruptcy because of your policies, and you threw her to the wolves to save your own image. You forced her to close her doors to the public, but you expected her to open them for the Queen. It's the same pattern we see with climate change, lecturing Americans about their carbon footprint, telling them to take the bus or buy a $60,000 electric vehicle while flying private everywhere. Congressional records show Pelosi burns more carbon in a single trip than most families do in an entire year. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's a hierarchy. If you're tired of being lectured by people who won't even follow their own rules, hit that like button and share this video. The mainstream media has tried to bury this footage for years, but the receipts are right here. The tension in the studio reached a boiling point as Tulsi moved to the final symbol of institutional disrespect. She queued up the video of the 2020 State of the Union address. Everyone had seen it, but watching it now felt different. As President Trump finished his speech, Pelosi stood behind him and systematically tore her copy of the address in half, then tore it again, all for the cameras. "You practiced that?" Tulsi said. "You pre-ripped the pages to make sure they tore cleanly. But let's talk about what was actually in that speech you desecrated." Tulsi pulled up the transcript, her voice vibrating with a soldier's indignation. In that speech, the president recognized Stacy, a second-grade student and cancer survivor. He honored Charles McGee, one of the last surviving Tuskegee Airmen, a 100-year-old hero who served in World War II. You didn't just rip up a Trump speech, you ripped up the tribute to a child who beat death and a veteran who fought for your right to sit in that chair. You desecrated the legacy of a Tuskegee Airman just to get a 5-second clip for your base and feed your own ego. Tulsi then cited the legal code, noting that 8 U.S. Code Section 2071 prohibits the willful destruction of official government records, a violation that technically carries the penalty of disqualification from holding office. "But you're still here," Tulsi noted with a dry, cynical laugh. "No consequences, no accountability. Because in your world, dignity and norms are just words you use to weaponize the system against your enemies, while you show none of it yourself. You talk about the sanctity of our institutions while you literally tear them apart on live television. The audience began to applaud, a slow build that signaled the end was near for the veteran politician. Pelosi sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly, her composure completely shattered by the weight of her own documented hypocrisy. It wasn't just paper she was ripping back then, it was the trust of the American people. She had painted herself as the defender of democracy, but Tulsi had just exposed her as its most entitled aristocrat. The room fell silent as Tulsi stood up for the second time, preparing to deliver her final verdict on what it truly means to be a public servant. One career was clearly beginning to ascend with the power of truth, as another, a 37-year empire built on elitism and extraction, crumbled into history before our very eyes. The final comparison was coming, and Pelosi had absolutely nothing left in her arsenal to stop it. Stay tuned for the final minute that changed American politics forever. The real public servant. The room fell silent as Tulsi Gabbard delivered her final verdict. The air in the News Nation studio was thick with the weight of a 37-year legacy that had just been methodically dismantled in front of a live audience. Tulsi stood up only the second time she had stood during the entire debate, and everyone in the building knew this was the finale. She walked to the center of the stage, positioning herself between Nancy Pelosi and the cameras, her presence commanding every eye in the room. "You've spent this entire hour attacking my service, my patriotism, and my loyalty," Tulsi began, her voice possessing the steady cadence of a formal military report. "You called me a useful idiot for Putin. You questioned my commitment to America. So, let's compare our service directly, point by point. Let America decide who the real public servant is." She looked directly into the camera, her expression hard as steel. "I enlisted in the Army National Guard in 2003. I deployed to Iraq in 2004 combat zones, mortars, IEDs, real danger. I deployed to Kuwait in 2008. I have served in uniform for over 20 years, and I am still serving today as a lieutenant colonel. I gave up safety, comfort, and birthdays to serve in dangerous places. That is what service looks like." She turned back to face Pelosi, who sat frozen in her chair, her face completely drained of color. "Your turn, Nancy. Tell us about your service. You've been in Congress for 37 years, but you never once put on a uniform. Your service has been entirely in Washington, D.C., one of the wealthiest cities in America. Your net worth went from $40 million to over $250 million, while your district fell into chaos. I make my congressional salary. I don't trade stocks based on my votes. I don't have a husband who miraculously times investments around legislation I control. I don't live in a $25 million mansion behind gates. I serve. You profit." The contrast was devastating. The choice for America was now obvious. Combat boots versus designer suits. Sacrifice versus self-service. "You are everything wrong with Washington, Nancy." Tulsi delivered the final blow with quiet contempt. "You attack veterans while you've never served anything except your own interests. I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The party left me to become the party of Nancy Pelosi, the party of insider trading and luxury lifestyles while preaching equality to the peasants. I trust the judgment of the American people to decide who the real public servant is." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then someone in the audience started clapping. Then another. Within moments, most of the audience, even some who had arrived as Pelosi supporters, were on their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. Pelosi sat motionless, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the floor. Her 37-year career had effectively ended in 90 minutes. The viral aftermath was instantaneous. The video hit the internet before they even left the building, with the number "Useful Idiot" hashtag trending #1 within 20 minutes, but turned against Pelosi. Within 24 hours, the confrontation had 89 million views. By 96 hours, it reached a staggering 156 million views, making it one of the most watched political moments in history. The Marie Antoinette comparison and the stock trading spreadsheets were shared across every platform, forcing even friendly media outlets like CNN to admit the timing of the Pelosi trades was troubling. The political fallout was swift. Within 48 hours, 3 separate ethics complaints were filed. The SEC announced a review of congressional stock trading patterns. Polling showed Pelosi's approval rating in her own district plummeted to just 31%, with 61% disapproving. A week later, Pelosi announced she would not seek any leadership positions. 1 month later, legislation to ban congressional stock trading passed the House 352 to 73. Pelosi was one of the few who voted no. Finally, 2 months after the debate, Nancy Pelosi announced she would not seek re-election in 2026. Tulsi Gabbard had changed the fundamental narrative of American politics. She showed that documentation could defeat power, and that a prepared opponent with receipts could destroy even the most entrenched elite. As the cameras cut to black, the image that remained was Tulsi walking away with the composure of a soldier who had completed a mission, while Pelosi's empire crumbled into the pages of history. It wasn't Republican versus Democrat. It was service versus self-service. And in 90 minutes, Tulsi Gabbard showed the world exactly what real public service looks like. One career began as another ended.